Hello, welcome to our next lesson in critical thinking where we're going to be looking at causal arguments. So there are many different kinds and meanings of cause and aspects of some kind of event, let's say, being a cause. So first, let's look at just what a cause is. A cause is an event or state of affairs that produces another event or state of affairs, where that other event that is produced is the effect. So there's cause and effect. And we can think here that there are many instances where we see things like cause and effect. For example, when I press the power button to my laptop, that causes an effect of my computer turning on. But we can look at various different kinds and meanings of causes. For example, there's a causal necessary condition. This is an event that's required for the production of another event. So it is what it sounds like. It's necessary. So if there's a cause that's necessary, that means that cause is required in order to produce a particular event. For example, let's say we want to get a lighter, a kind of standard Bic lighter, to get it to light. Well, what might be some necessary conditions, causal conditions, for causing this lighter to light? Well, flicking the wheel on a lighter is one necessary causal condition to cause the lighter to light, right? You have to flick the wheel. Also, there needs to be oxygen, right, where you are flicking the lighter. There has to be oxygen in order to cause the lighter to light. So those are just some necessary causal conditions for causing the lighter to light. Next, let's discuss sufficient conditions, causal sufficient conditions. This is an event that all by itself will always produce or cause another event. Here's an example of a causal sufficient condition. For example, there is a case where in the game of basketball, the basketball being dunked in a game is sufficient to score points. So if you dunk a basketball in a game, that is enough. That all by itself will be enough to produce the next event, namely getting points for your team. Okay, so next let's look at a causal, necessary, and sufficient condition. That's an event that's required for the production of another event and will produce that event all by itself. In other words, this is a causal condition that is both necessary and sufficient. So it satisfies both of the previous kinds of causal conditions. It's an event that's required or necessary for the production of a particular event, and all by itself, it is sufficient to produce this particular event in itself. Here's an example. Crossing the equator is a causal, necessary, and sufficient condition for moving across from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere, and vice versa. Moving from the southern hemisphere to the northern hemisphere, it's necessary that you must cross the equator, and it's sufficient. Once you do it, that itself is sufficient to move from one, either northern hemisphere or southern hemisphere, to its opposite. And to give you some more examples of necessary conditions, sufficient conditions, and necessary and sufficient conditions, let's return to the game of basketball. Let's say we want to play a game of basketball, and in order to score points, in order to have that effect, what about the condition of someone remembering to bring a basketball to the playground? Is that necessary in order for someone to score any points in our game of basketball? That someone actually brings a basketball? Yes, that is necessary. Is that sufficient, though, to score points in a game of basketball? No, that's not sufficient, right? Just the mere fact that someone brings a basketball to a game is not sufficient to cause a team to score points, right? Something further needs to happen. It could be the case that in our game of basketball, no one scores any points, even though someone remembers to bring a basketball. So we see here that since it's not sufficient, it also, bringing a basketball is not sufficient, but it is necessary. Well, given this, we know that it cannot be a necessary and sufficient condition because it's not a sufficient condition. And dunking the basketball, we already talked about that. Slam dunking a basketball in a game, that's sufficient, right? that's in and of itself is sufficient to score points. Is that necessary? Is that required to score points in a game of basketball? No, it's not. You don't necessarily have to dunk a basketball in a game in order to score points. You could, for example, take a long-range jump shot and have the ball go through the hoop, and that also would score points. You don't have to slam dunk a basketball. So we know slam dunking a basketball then must not be a necessary and sufficient condition, since it's not a necessary condition. What about in a game if the ball goes through the hoop? Is that necessary to score points in a game of basketball, the ball going through a hoop? Yes, that is necessary. Is that sufficient to score a point or points in a game of basketball? Yes, the ball going through the hoop is sufficient. So we know that the ball going through the hoop is a necessary and sufficient condition for scoring points in a game of basketball. Let's look at the next kind of cause here. It's a contributory cause. This is an event that has an effect on another event, but it's neither a necessary nor sufficient cause. It's not a necessary condition. It's not a sufficient condition, and so therefore it's not a necessary and sufficient condition. But it still has is a cause for an effect. For example, one case of this would be sometimes running backs in football, they do ballet in order to be better at football because it teaches them balance. Is that necessary to be good at football, to take ballet lessons? No, not necessarily. Is that sufficient? In other words, if you take ballet classes, that's sufficient and you will then be good at football. No, that's not a sufficient condition. There are many more things you need to do in order to be good at football, such as being fast if you're a running back. However, so we know that this is not a necessary and sufficient condition to excel at football either. So it's none of these kinds of causes. Rather, it's a contributory cause. Okay, let's move on and discuss proximate and remote causes. A proximate cause is a cause that is close in time to its effect. A remote cause is a cause that's far in time from its effect. And there is some vagueness here of trying to determine whether a cause is a proximate cause or a remote cause. Just given the nature of the beast, there can be gray areas where it's unclear whether a particular cause is a proximate or rather a remote cause. But to give you an example of proximate or remote causes, the desire to play tennis is a remote cause for your current bodily movements of playing tennis. Let's say right now you're playing tennis. Well, one factor that caused you to play tennis, what you're doing right now, well, one cause was that you had a desire to play tennis, let's say yesterday. You said, well, I want to play tennis tomorrow. That desire caused you to, in part, cause you to play tennis, what you're doing currently right now, supposedly. And this desire is a remote cause. It happened yesterday, happened a while ago. However, while your subconscious knowledge of how to play tennis, let's say, is the proximate cause for your current movements. So your current movements right now while you're playing tennis, let's say you're a good tennis player and you don't have to think when you're playing tennis, right? You don't have to map out and really contemplate each and every move that you do, but you're good at tennis, you've played for a long time, you just automatically move and your subconscious kind of takes over. So your subconscious taking over and telling you where to go and how to swing the racket and how hard to hit the ball, etc., that is the proximate cause. Right? That's the cause that's close in time to the effect of you playing tennis right now. Whereas your desire that arose yesterday, saying, oh, tomorrow I want to play tennis, that is the remote cause. Okay, so let's talk about identifying causal arguments. So what is first a causal argument? Well, a causal argument is an argument whose conclusion asserts that one event caused another event. So that's what is stated in the conclusion. So you need the requisite or required premises in order to try to justify a causal argument. For example, a causal argument might try to say this mental state caused this other mental state based on psychology and neuroscience studies, for example. Here are some examples of some indicator words that there is a causal argument. It doesn't necessarily mean that there is a causal argument, but they're kind of general indicators where at many times when they are used, they do indicate that there's a causal argument present. And these are words like because, led to, influenced, produce, created, affect, so on and so forth. Okay, so let's look at examples of causal argument structures. And let's look at the first column first. And this has a causal argument that would be a proper causal argument, how it kind of looks like formally in logical form with variables. So the first premise would be something like this. E1 is correlated with E2. Here, E1 refers to one type of event. E2 refers to another event. So for E1, we're talking about event 1. E2, we're talking about event 2. Second premise, E2 is not the cause of E1. So as we're going to get into discuss further, when things are correlated, that merely means that they co-occur. That means that when E1 happens, E2 happens, and vice versa. When you see E2 happen, well, somewhere close in time, E1 happens. So they tend to co-occur. And the second premise is saying, well, E2 does not cause E1 to occur. As we kind of sneak down and cheat down and look at the conclusion of this argument, we see that the conclusion is that E1 is a cause of E2. So in order to help justify this causal conclusion, we need to establish, after correlation, we need to establish what's stated in the second premise, that E2 doesn't cause E1. Because when you have correlation, it could be the case that E1 causes E2, or perhaps E2 causes E1. So P2 eliminates the possibility that E2 causes E1. The third premise is this. There is no E3, in other words, a third event that is a kind of underlying cause that is the cause of both E1 and E2. So if we want to establish that E1 causes E2 in our conclusion, it cannot be the case that there is some third event that really causes E1 to occur and E2 to occur, where E1 and E2 both are correlated and co-occur, not because E1 causes E2 to occur, but because E3 causes both E1 and E2 to occur. That's why E1 and E2 are correlated, even though there is no causation between E1 and E2. The fourth premise is this. E1 and E2 are not coincidentally correlated. They're not kind of accidental correlations, or it's just not mere coincidence that E1 and E2 are correlated or co-occur with each other. Conclusion. Once you've established this, only then all the above properly, all four premises, would you then be justified in your causal argument for drawing the conclusion that E1 is a cause of E2. So if you've noticed, there's a lot of moving parts here, a lot of things that need to be established in order to properly make a causal claim and a causal argument. All right, so let's look at the second column now, and let's look at an example. So let's say the power button being depressed is correlated with the desktop computer being on. So there's desktop computer. I'm going to be using CPU as shorthand for this computer from here on out for this argument. But there seems to be a correlation. When the computer is on, it happens to be the case that the power button is depressed, and vice versa. When the power button is on, it happens to be the case within a short amount of time that the computer is on. Second premise, the CPU being on is not the cause of the button being depressed. So what this is trying to establish, it corresponds to the argument in the first column, is trying to establish that one direction of causation is not the case. Perhaps maybe this premise might be established by saying that the computer only comes on after the button is depressed. Right? That could help establish the second premise. So therefore, it cannot be the case that the computer being on causes the button to then become depressed. Right? That's not the case. Third premise, which again matches the third premise in the first column, There is no third event that is the cause of both the button being depressed and the CP being on. This is trying to eliminate a third causal claim that really might be the underlying reason why the first event and the second event are correlated. Right? And if this was the case, then it wouldn't be true that, in our conclusion, the button being depressed is a cause of the CPU being on. Or at least we would not be justified in believing that conclusion as of yet. The fourth premise, the button being depressed and the CPU being on are not coincidentally correlated. They're just not it's not just merely a coincidence. Right? That's what the fourth premise is trying to establish. And perhaps maybe some evidence given for this fourth premise might be maybe appeal to experts, right? Computer experts say that you need to depress the power button in order to turn your desktop computer on, right? And that itself shows that this kind of correlation is not coincidental. It's just not some kind of random happenstance by chance, for example, but there really looks like there might be something deeper going on here. So once you've established the four premises, then you would be warranted in justifying the conclusion the button being depressed is a cause of the computer being on. So let's look closer in regards to the previous slide. Let's have an analysis of the components of a causal argument in regards to the four premises. And what I have numbered here, 1 through 4, each correspond and are talking about the respective premise. So number 1 here on this slide is referring to P1. So two events are correlated when they happen together. That's what it means for two events to be correlated. The depressed power button on the computer, that's event E1, and the computer turning on or being on, that's the second event. E1 and E2 are correlated. They tend to co-occur. Second premise, or second statement here, the first event wasn't caused by the second. Once again, this is trying to establish that, well, they're correlated, so therefore E1 could cause E2, or it could be the case that E2 causes E1. Well, the second premise tries to establish that one of those directions of causation is not true, and this is something that needs to be established. So in this case, the computer turning on didn't cause the button to be depressed. Third, there isn't any third thing that caused both E1 and E2. For example, there was no electrical substation malfunction. That didn't cause a power surge of electricity that both depressed the button and caused the computer to turn on. There was no some kind of third event there. Right, so that possibility is eliminated. And then fourth, the correlation between the two events isn't a mere accidental coincidence. Here are some examples of accidental coincidences. For example, let's say I decide to bring my rabbit's foot, my lucky rabbit's foot, with me to work, and then that day my boss happens to compliment me on my work performance. I might think to myself, perhaps my rabbit foot, my lucky rabbit foot, caused my boss to compliment me and think I'm a good worker. However, that's just a mere coincidence. That's an accidental coincidence. That's not causation. The rabbit's foot did not cause my boss to then compliment me at work. There is also in baseball rally caps. So a lot of athletes in baseball are very superstitious. They take their baseball hats and they turn them inside out and then put on their hats inside out. And that supposedly brings luck when they're up at bat so that they can score a lot of runs in one inning. Now, let's say a team puts on their rally caps, so to speak, and they score lots of runs in that inning. Is it the case that the rally caps caused that team to score lots of runs in that inning? No, that's just a mere coincidence, right? It's an accidental coincidence. There really is no causation where the rally caps caused the team to do well. Okay, so let's look at some problems. And here we'll be interested in whether or not each problem is a necessary condition, a sufficient condition, a necessary and sufficient condition, or a contributory cause for being a good driver, what's generally understood as being a good driver. So let's look at the first problem here. It says driving on the right side of the road. So let's say you're driving on the correct side of the road. which of the above does this fall under? Example, is it a contributory cause? What kind of cause is it? Well, in this case, it's a necessary cause. In order to be a good driver, one thing you must do that's necessary to be a good driver, you have to make sure you drive on the correct side of the road. Don't drive on the wrong side of the road. Right? That's one necessary condition. It's necessary for being a good driver. Is it sufficient if you drive on the correct side of the road? Is that in and of itself sufficient for being a good driver? No, not necessarily. Maybe you're a speed demon, but you still drive on the right side of the road, or maybe you don't obey traffic signs and signals, but you still drive on the right side of the road. That would not make you a good driver, right? That's not sufficient. Driving on the right side of the road, in and of itself, by itself, is not sufficient to be a good driver. Rather, more criteria need to be satisfied in order to be a good driver. So since it's not a sufficient condition, this is not a necessary and sufficient condition, right? And this is not a contributory cause, because contributory causes are causes that are not necessary, nor are they sufficient. Okay, let's look at the next problem. Imagining every turn in detail you'll have to make to drive to your neighborhood grocery store before you actually make the drive. So let's say you have a neighborhood grocery store that you've driven to many times before and it's really no big deal, but let's say you imagine, before you get in your car, you imagine every turn and every aspect of the drive and what you're going to do when you approach these turns, etc., in your drive to your local neighborhood grocery store. Is that, what kind of, does that cause one to be a good driver? And if so, what kind of cause would it be? So in this case, that could cause you to be a good driver, right? That could, right? Planning everything out, and then that can help you execute your plan appropriately. But is it a necessary cause? Is it necessary to drive to your neighborhood grocery store well, a grocery store that you've driven to countless times before? No, it's not necessary, right? A lot of times when we drive, we don't even concentrate on driving. Rather, our subconscious kind of takes over, especially when we're going to places that we've driven to many times before. Is it sufficient for being a good driver? No, it's not sufficient, because you can imagine every turn you make before hopping in your car, but you're still not a good driver. Maybe you don't have good physical coordination and you get in a lot of accidents. Right, that could be the case. So making these kinds of imaginations is not sufficient. So therefore, this is not necessary and sufficient, but rather this is a contributory cause. It's not a necessary cause, it's not a sufficient cause, it's not a necessary and sufficient cause, but it is a cause that can cause one to be a good driver, so this is a contributory cause. Third, knowing and always applying everything they teach you at the best driver's education school and being able to execute all aspects of driving perfectly. In other words, all aspects of driving, you do it perfectly, and you know all the rules that are taught at the best rules of driving that are taught at the best driver's education schools, and you always apply these rules. Is that, what kind of cause is that for being a good driver? Well, are all these things, is that necessary? Are they necessary for being a good driver? Yes, they are necessary for being a good driver. Are they sufficient for being a good driver? Yes, they are sufficient. If you do them in and of themselves, then they are sufficient. And in this case, so here we have a necessary and sufficient condition. However, in that respect, it is not a contributory cause. For number 4, using one's turning signal appropriately. Is this, what kind of cause is this for being a good driver? Is this necessary for being a good driver? Yes, it is necessary. For example, you use your turning signal at a 4-way stop to let other people know which way you're going, or use your turning signal to move into a lane where there might be many cars, to let them, give them a heads up that you're trying to move into their lane, and to take the appropriate precautions. It's necessary. Is it sufficient all by itself? Will it be enough to be a good driver? No, it's not. It's not enough. For example, you could be someone who uses their turning signal, but once again, you might be someone who's a klutz and you get into a lot of accidents. So this is therefore not a necessary and sufficient condition, and it's not a contributory cause because it's a necessary cause. All right, so let's look at the next set of problems. What's the problem, if any, with the causal arguments? For the first one, there's a correlation between political decision-making and activation in the emotional regions of the brain. Therefore, emotions influence political decision-making. So what are the problems, if any? Well, right off the bat, we have nothing here about some kind of third cause or perhaps some kind of accidental correlation or coincidental correlation here in this argument. It could be the case, if this argument was in a larger context, that those kinds of premises might be unstated premises. That possibly could be the case. But the most immediate problem here is that all that has been established is correlation. All that has been established between political decision-making and activation in emotional regions of the brain is that there's a correlation between the two. Perhaps maybe this was discovered through an fMRI brain scan. Right? All that establishes is mere correlation, not necessarily causation. So with only the establishment of correlation, it could be the case that emotions influence political decision-making, or it could be the case that political decision-making influences the activation of emotions. For example, I might make a political decision that this person is a bad politician, and then that itself causes me to then feel the emotion of anger. Or vice versa, it could be the case that the emotion of anger influences me to judge that this politician is a bad person. So insofar as only correlation has been established, one would not be warranted in concluding that emotions causally influence political decision-making. Right? Much more work would need to be done, such as having a premise that shows it's not the case that decision-making is what influences emotions. Right? The tables are not turned. That would have to be established. Let's look at the next one. Whenever the soccer goalie wears green gloves, she saves all the shots. Saving all the shots certainly doesn't cause her to wear the green gloves. And there's no hidden third cause that causes her to wear green gloves and that saves all the shots. Hence, wearing green gloves causes her to save all the shots. So here we have a causal argument. And in the premises, what's stated is that there is no kind of reverse causation where all the shots cause her to wear the green gloves, right? That's not the case. And also what's attempted to be established is to eliminate the possibility of a third event that is an underlying cause for both E1 and E2 in this situation. So therefore, if the premises are true in this argument, does it then follow that wearing green gloves causes her to save all the shots, that this causal claim can be appropriately established? In this situation, not yet, right? Because we need to examine whether or not this is a mere coincidence. Right? If this is a mere coincidence, and it very well likely is a mere coincidence, because we know that green gloves through many times watching soccer games, that it's not always the time that green gloves, when a goalie wears them, they stop all the shots, right? So this could just be an accidental or coincidental correlation, kind of like the rabbit's foot and your boss telling you that you did a good job at work today. It's just a mere coincidence that there's a correlation between these two events. All right, so let's look at the next one. There's a correlation between me getting pimples and eating greasy foods. I know that getting pimples don't cause me to eat greasy foods. So I believe that greasy foods cause me to get pimples. I know that greasy foods can cause one to have pimples, so it is not mere coincidence that this is happening. Right? So this is trying to establish the conclusion that I believe that greasy foods cause me to get pimples. There's a correlation between eating greasy foods and getting pimples. Right? And there is a premise contained in this argument in the second sentence. I know that getting pimples don't cause me to eat greasy foods. So this person is trying to establish that one direction of causation is not true, that the pimples cause me to eat greasy foods. That's not true. Also, there's an attempt to address here that there is no coincidental correlation, right? That's contained in the last sentence. I know that greasy foods can cause one to have pimples, so it is no mere coincidence that this is happening. So in this particular case, does the conclusion then follow? Is it properly supported, let's say, if the premises are true? In this situation, or in this argument, not yet. Right? The causal argument has not yet been established. And that's because what needs to be, in order to establish it, you need to eliminate the possibility of plausible underlying third events, where there's some kind of third event that causes E1 and E2 to both occur and be correlated with each other. But really, there is no causation between getting pimples and eating greasy foods. For example, it could be the case that I get stressed out a lot, and the stress is the third cause, which is an underlying cause that both causes me to get pimples and the stress causes me to eat a lot of food, and I happen to eat greasy food when I get stressed out. So it's not the case that the greasy foods is causing me to get pimples, but it's really the case that there's a hidden third cause or third event that is causing both the pimples and the eating of greasy foods to be correlated. But there is no causal connection between getting pimples and eating greasy foods. So that possibility has to be eliminated in order to establish a proper causal conclusion. All right, so that's all I have for you in this lesson, and I will see you for the next.